All right, guys, we are starting 4.1 graphing sine and cosine, and I'm going to do my best to keep this as short and sweet so that we can spend all of class time practicing what we learn. So you heard that right. We can graph sine and cosine. There are some important vocabulary words there. The two most important being amp and period. But we will go into those more later. Remember, these notes are accessible through the class notebook in Canvas. Reminder, this is a unit circle. We started talking about this last semester. Had we had enough time, we would have done graphing with your last test. Some things that I want to point out that I think will make this easier to comprehend is remember that 1/2 is just a decimal 0.5. I think some of us are a little scared of fractions and forget that actually that's just 0.5, that it's the number directly in between 0 and 1. Square root of 2 over 2 is also just a type of decimal. So if I were to type that into the calculator, I would get 0.707. It goes on forever because it's irrational, but approximately 7/10, okay? Square root of 3 over 2 is approximately 0.866. So, approximately 0.9, getting real close to 1. So if we then remember that the sine of any degree or radian, so any angle, was always the y value, cosine is the x value. Let's use what we know and fill in a little table here, because remember, a graph is created from the table of outputs. So our x values are all the radians. It is typical to graph your x-axis in radians because those are actual numbers. Pi over 2 is 3.14 divided by 2. Pi is 3.14. So it is more popular to graph by radians than it is in degrees. Okay. Sine is the y value. So if I zoom out a little bit, it might get a little small to read. But if I'm looking at the y value at 0 degrees, it's 0. If I'm looking at the y value at pi over 6, it's 0.5. At pi over 4, it's 0.7. Again, I'm using those rounded numbers because those are easier to graph than thinking of something crazy like square root of 2 over 2. Pi over 3 is approximately 0.9 if I'm doing that. The y value here is 1. Then notice it starts going back down. So 0.9. 0.7, 0.5, and then back to 0. And then notice all the y values are negative. I'm not going to write all of those out in the table, but I definitely could. They start getting negative. Then at 3 pi over 2, it drops down to -1. And then at 2 pi, that's the same as 0 degrees, is 0. And then if you think about it, anything bigger than that's just going to repeat because it's going around a circle again and again and again, okay? So if I were to graph those, 0, 0, pi over 2 was at 1, pi was at 0, 3 pi over 2 was at -1, 2 pi was at 0. Now, I could also put all those little decimals too. Notice that they fall right in line to make this shape right here. That is known as the sine curve, okay? It does repeat forever and ever unless otherwise noted. So that means your domain is all real numbers. But notice your range. There's a bottom and a top. And I didn't draw it very well, but they should be the same. So it should keep bouncing back and forth from -1 to 1. Bottom to top, bottom to top. All right. Notice we have some x-intercepts there at 0, at pi, at 2 pi. If I were to go backwards, looks like -pi should have been if my graph was accurate here. There's a little more accurate drawing, but whatever. Your y-intercept is at 0. Max is at 1. Minimum is -1. So I know I'm kind of going through some of these properties fast. We'll talk more in depth in class. You are just kind of saying like, oh, this is what it looks like. This is what we're talking about. So here are the two words that I really want you to pay attention to. Amplitude and period. So amplitude is the total height divided by 2. Now, if the middle ground is the x-axis, it's just the height. It's just like, so in this case, 1. But if I think about the total height is actually 2 high. And then 2 divided by 2 is 1. So the amplitude is 1. And since by definition it is height, we do not talk about negatives when we're talking about amplitude. Okay. The period is how often does a cycle repeat. Go ahead and giggle because we know what a period is. We also know that it's how often your cycle repeats. Okay, so in terms of math, if I started here, highlighted until it would repeat over and over, this would be the piece that repeats over and over. So notice that it's the same piece over and over, okay? For normal sine curve, the period is 2 pi. It repeats every 2 pi and it goes on and on, okay? Now, I'm going to actually stop the video after this, but please notice we're also going to do the cosine curve. So go ahead and ask yourself, what would be different? What would be the same? We're also going to talk about in class what happens when amplitudes are different, what happens when periods are different than the parent graph, so the basic graph. We're going to talk about phase shifts, which are also known as horizontal shifts. If you remember Algebra 2, going left, right, up, down. So the horizontal is now called phase shift. Vertical shift is up and down. And then we will do some practice for sine and cosine. So I shall see you soon in class.